Ted, here we are. Ted's quite an amazing character, but I won't embarrass him too badly. Do you like to be embarrassed, Ted? He's been around a few years. As you can see, his hair has changed colour. But he became a Christian way back in 1954 with a man called Billy Graham, who some of you may have heard of. And Ted's a man of many parts. He's been a professional musician, and he's played at the London Palladium for well-known people like Elton John and Cliff Richard and all these people. Yeah, so he knows them all. And but as well as all of that, he knows so much about the history of Norwich, especially its Christian history. And he's written a number of books. We have one of them that you can take for free at the back of the chapel. And but we'll have to forgive him because he's mostly a Baptist. Was that right? Yeah? Only in recent years. I became a Baptist minister, but I've never been belonging to the Baptist church before that. Oh, right. Right, okay. Well, I'm not going to say any more, except he's an amazing speaker, and I welcome you to the pulpit. Ted, it's all yours. Sorry to go on.
Good evening, friends. Regarding John's comment about music, I wasn't going to say anything, but my wife wants me to, that tomorrow evening we are taking part in a concert at the United Reformed Church in Ipswich Road. There's a wind band called the Sillars Band, which has been around for years and years. And sometimes when they do a concert, Penny and I and the conductor Barry on keyboard do a little interlude to give their lips a break, and because Penny's a singer, and we often do entertainments in care homes and that sort of thing. And we'll be singing some music, Jewish music, tomorrow night. The King and I, by Jewish, Richard Rogers, Oscar Hammerstein. They're Jews. And all the money that went into making it and putting it on was Jewish. People don't realise that. Anyway, in spite of all the build-up John gave to me, he didn't tell you the most important thing of all about me. Get ready for it, you might not believe it. I am the son of a carpenter. Now then, what about that for a Christian man? Yes. Right, to get down to business. We've got a lot to talk about tonight, and we're going to start right back at the beginning of the Reformation. And I shan't ask anyone to suggest the date for the beginning of the Reformation, because you might disgrace yourself and suggest All Souls Night 1517, when Luther pinned a letter on the door of the chapel at Wittenberg asking to see his bishop. He didn't put thesis on there. That came much later. He wanted to talk to his bishop and he didn't get it. That's not the beginning of the Reformation. Forget it. Luther himself knew that it wasn't and said often, John Huss in Bohemia started it. He was in before me. In fact, Luther was wrong there. He didn't know. It just information spread slowly around the world. He didn't know that John Huss was only who he was because of John Wycliffe in Oxford. And that is the beginning of the Reformation. It's not a forerunner that fades away and comes back. That is actually the beginning of the Reformation. In Oxford in the 1360s, this man was preaching and teaching, expounding scripture. He wasn't a popular preacher, which is the impression often given. He didn't stand outside of Tesco's giving out tracts and talking to people. Some of his followers did. Wycliffe only preached, as far as we know, in proper churches and chapels and proper religious settings. But he did write out his sermons, and they were copied and widely circulated. There are some 300 in existence in this country. And they had an enormous influence right down through all levels of society. He lectured and taught theology in Oxford, and when he expounded the scriptures, he had them copied out and circulated. So all sorts of people. And it wasn't just a working class movement. At the beginning, it was a very high class movement. Wycliffe knew the royal family. The king, Edward III, who was, I get the impression that he was a bit sort of mentally decayed and losing it. His son, the famous so-called Black Prince, a great warrior and soldier, and the Black Prince's wife, Princess Joan, they were friends of Wycliffe, and he met them and talked to them quite often. And the Black Prince's brother, John, Duke of Lancaster, who was known as John of Gaunt, he was a friend of Wycliffe's. And there were a whole lot of young men who were just sort of coming into the royal household, earning their spurs, becoming sort of assistants to the Black Prince and John of Gaunt, and rising, and they were very friendly with Wycliffe. They became known in later history as the Lollard Knights. But all of these guys, and Wycliffe was with those people, and Wycliffe's teaching went to ministers, vicars, friars, monks all around the country, and a lot of them hated it, but a lot of them were challenged and stirred and excited by it, wanted to know more and began to talk about it and preach about it. And the authorities didn't like it. And the Pope heard about it and he didn't like it. And in 1377, Wycliffe was summoned to London to see the Bishop of London and I think Archbishop of Canterbury and all these people who wanted to know what was going on and tell him to shut up. And he might have been imprisoned. Who knows what might have happened. But he turned up in London with John of Gaunt and a whole lot of other men. And the signal was, you don't touch him, mister. You leave him alone. By this time, Edward was quite ill. And in fact, he died, I think I'm right in saying, while Wycliffe was in London. But the Black Prince had already died. He predeceased his father. And so the Black Prince's son, Richard, became king, Richard II. He was only a boy. And so John of Gaunt suddenly became ruler of England. He was the regent. And he remained so for many years. So Wycliffe had very powerful friends in high places at the beginning. And then the peasants' revolt broke out, which Wycliffe was blamed for. He didn't really want it. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't encouraged it. Except that the very way in which his writings were going around, the Christian truth, which hadn't been heard in England for years properly, was now being heard, and the dignity of man, and the fact that God loves us all and we're all equal. This message always, when it's properly proclaimed, gets through to the lower classes in society, and they suddenly realise they're not lower classes at all. And so they start getting a bit uppity, and so this is why the peasants' revolt started. You can see why, but Wycliffe hadn't wanted it, and he was blamed for it. But even so, something happened, I'm not sure of the details, and he was then suspended from Oxford, told to go, and he went to Lutterworth, which was his holding, his living, his parish, and he stayed there for the last 2 or 3 years, and he died on the last day of 1384. And people have often commented that not the least of his achievements was the fact that he died in his own bed with his head on his shoulders, because in different circumstances he might not have done. But it was only just beginning. Things were spreading and spreading, and the Bible was spreading. You've probably read books about Wycliffe or articles in magazines over the years and seen photographs of the Wycliffe's translation of the Bible, and it's there's one in Hereford, Cathedral, and I think there's one in Norwich Cathedral. And this is the big thing, his translation of the Bible. And it spreads right through the 1390s and into the 1400s. In 1400, Richard was sidelined. Although he was very sympathetic to Wycliffe as he was growing up, he became more and more arrogant, very, very pompous, spent huge sums of money very lavishly and annoyed a lot of people. And he was sidelined. John of Gaunt died, and his son then became the Duke of Lancaster, Henry. And he sidelined Richard and had him imprisoned, and Richard died in prison. It's never certain if he just died or if he was killed. And Henry then became King Henry IV. And then something terrible happened. Henry IV had a law passed which made it a punishable offence to own a Bible in the English language. And our nation has the distinction of being, as far as is known, the only nation in the whole of the Western world, the whole of Europe, and the whole of Christendom, where it was forbidden to have your Bible in your own language. It's never happened in any other country. Terrible thing. And people could be executed for owning the Bible. English, by the way, had grown. Back in 1300, at the beginning of the century, upper-class people all spoke French. Hyacinth Bouquet would have spoken French. Anybody who was anybody spoke French. Latin was the law of was a language of church and law. French, the language of royalty and aristocracy and upper class people. English, the language of the ordinary man in the street. By the time we get to 1400s, English is growing rapidly and overtaking French is almost pushed out. And Henry IV was the first king of England since Norman conquest for whom English was his mother tongue. He didn't speak French. Wycliffe probably spoke French when he was talking to the Black Prince and all these people when he was in the palace. But it was the great age, that century of the English language, the age of Chaucer, of course, and all that. But the Bible goes on being copied and circulated, and when it's persecuted, burned, a lot of it is taken across especially to the kingdom of Bohemia, what we refer nowadays as the Czech Republic. And Jan Hus is there, John Hus, and this great movement is starting there as well, and that owes all its basis really to Wycliffe and his writings. And the Bible, Wycliffe's translate this Bible goes on all through the century and through the Tudor times. It's said that Tyndale had a Wycliffite Bible, although it's uncertain how much you would have understood of it because of the language changing. Burghley, William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's chief minister at the end of the Tudor age, he had a Wycliffe Bible. And of course by then it had gone into print because printing had been invented. So some never printed in this country. Caxton or nobody else would dare to do it because it was too dangerous, and it was always printed abroad and smuggled back in. Anybody got any idea when the last copy of a Wycliffe translation was ever printed in this country? Anybody want to hazard a guess? I'll tell you. I might be wrong. It's the one I know, 2002. And it's a copy of it down there. You can come and have a look at afterwards. Published by the British Library, British Museum. And you too can have one. If you go to Revelation and ask Steve Foister, I'm sure he'll order one for you. I would suggest doing that rather than looking on the web and getting it from Amazon cheaper. But I expect some of you are thinking of that already. But it's better to support the local bookshop. But it's there. You can get it. And it wasn't until about 1830 and 1840 that two men, an Anglican clergyman called Josiah McFadden and an aristocratic man, Sir Francis, it was Falshaw, Josiah Forshaw and Sir Francis Madden, they got together and they went all around England looking at all the Wycliffe Bibles they could find in private collections, museums, university libraries, archives, all that sort of thing. And they were looking at all these things. They studied 170 altogether. And guess what? Every one of them was different. No two the same. And none of them by Wycliffe. He'd never translated the Bible into English. And we know that. I'll tell you why in a minute. And these two gents, they classified everything as early version, which was in the 1370s and 80s, they reckoned. And it's as if someone has looked at the Latin and just translated almost word for word, fairly rigid, stiff, not very idiomatic English. And then the later ones from the 1390s through into the 1400s, they're much more good English, as if they understand the Latin and they're putting it into English. And they classified them as early version and late version. Modern scholars, looking at them more over the years, classify them as early version 1, early version 2, 3, 4, and they gradually merge into late version 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are some that have got mixtures of both, and some that are totally different. And what is interesting is there is such a vast amount of Bible translated by Wycliffe in his sermons and in his theological writings. So you can compare all these manuscripts with what we know he did, and his translations are better, because he was a greater scholar. If he had done those early ones, right from the beginning, they would have been better. And down here, I'll put below, there's a piece of paper there with 2 columns. One of it's Isaiah chapter 2, first few verses, taken from the early version and then the later version, so you can have a look. And then the other one has got 3 columns. Left hand it's the story of our Lord talking to the woman at the well, John chapter 4. Left hand column is the early version. Right hand middle column is the late version. Right hand column is Wycliffe's own translation from his sermon on that, so you can compare them. They're actually quite similar, the sermon and the later version. The edition that they published down there, the New Testament, is 1388 manuscript. So have a look at that afterwards. But what we got to think about now is the reaction of our nation to these Bibles as they circulated. And as I said, in 1401, a law was passed saying it was illegal to own a Bible in the English language without permission of your bishop, and it was a punishable offence. Some people had been executed before this in the 1390s, but it wasn't for owning a Bible, it was for the theology that they came out of it. They'd been reading and listening to sermons, and they began, it's all the usual stuff. I won't go into what it is, because you know the sort of stuff that's launched against the Catholic Church, criticism of the Mass and of worship of saints and of purgatory and of all these different things. But from 1401 onwards, this is when it really gets serious. And in 1428 to 31, there was a big series of heresy trials here in our city, Norwich. Bishop Alnwick, who was the bishop, Alnwick, I don't know how you would have pronounced it, he presided over these trials, and over 200 people were tried on charges of heresy. This happened all over England, but it just happens that the Norwich trials are the best recorded. We've got complete sort of script of everything that went on. Nothing else like that anywhere in the country. And you can see them in the Norwich Library. If you go into the Millennium Library and upstairs to the local studies, they're all there in volumes of them. You can see them on the shelf, and you can take them off and read these trials, what happened. And I said it was 1428 to 1431. Not many people were actually burned as a result of those trials. A lot were imprisoned, and that could be a death sentence to go to prison in those days, because they were filthy, foul places. and you could, if you stayed any length of time, you were likely to catch some terrible disease and die. Down there's also a map on the table at the end there. It's the Cunningham map of 1558, and it's the first map of any city in this country ever to be drawn up, so we're told, and one of the first of any city in Europe. It's beautiful. It's not like a modern map. It's just got a picture, and it's got lots of letters on it identifying certain places, and then you look at the key at the bottom and it tells you what those places are. This map hasn't got the key on it because I took it from the inside of a book, Frank Mears's book about Norwich. If you go to the Millennium Library upstairs in the local studies, go to the map tray there, great big map case, and it's in there, four great big cardboard sections. You can lay them on top, put them all together and see it. And it's wonderful. But you'll see, if you look just by Bishop Bridge, just above it, the other side of the road, there's a letter C. And if you look at the key at the bottom, on the other proper map it's there, if you look and see, what is letter C identifying? And it says, the place where men are customarily burned. Marvellous, isn't it? That's our city. And interestingly, 1558, it's not called the Lollard's Pit. I'm not certain when that name first started to be used. I can't find any reference to that. The word Lollard is a Dutch word, apparently. Some people say that it means people who mutter. And these people are in a corner muttering away, these heretics. Other people say that it was a Dutch word for a certain type of weed, useless weed. And if you trod on it and squeezed it under your foot, it let out a horrible smell. And that was the way people described these heretics. But nobody seems to know for certain. They themselves always called one another known men. They said, God knows us. He knows who we are. And we know one another. When we meet, we recognise a kinship. That was their name. And they were definitely called Lollards right back in the 1390s. But when the name Lollard's Pit, I take it you all know where the Lollard's Pit is. It's just there on the opposite Bishop Bridge. Up Rosary Road goes up. And there's a pub now called the Lollard's Pit. And if you go into the car park round the corner, there was a shop there. It's got a different name now compared to what it was. For years it was a sort of hardware furniture shop. It's something else now. I don't know what it is. But if you go into that car park and look up on the wall at the side, you'll see there's a plaque there also engraved saying this was the site of the Lollard's Pit. And just opposite on the embankment is the memorial, Martyrs Memorial. I put a photograph of that down there. It's fenced in at the moment. Men are doing some work there. But you can still walk over and go down and have a look. I went the other day and they didn't take any notice of me and I just had a look at it. So, I want to go through now the names that are on that memorial and some others of people. There are forerunners, don't forget, Christians who believed similar things to us, not always exactly the same, but they suffered for their faith and paved the way to some extent for the religious freedom that you and I have here tonight. Because we come in here, we don't bat an eyelid. No one's going to come and stop us and say, you can't be in there, what are you doing? But in the past, that was the case. Now, the first name on that memorial there is William White. And he was a priest who read the Bible and he entered into a true experience of salvation. So he left the priesthood and got married. And he travelled all around East Anglian region, preaching and teaching. And he's been described as a Lollard missionary. And he was burned there in 1428. It's only his name, he's the only one. It says William White, 1428. doesn't mention two other men who were apparently burned with him on the same day, John Wadden and Hugh Pye. Don't know who they are, where they came from. Pye led a Bible discussion group, and he taught that priests could not turn bread into the body of Christ. He said it's wrong, they don't do that. It's not possible. So that was his crime, and he was arrested and burned. Then there was a man called Thomas Wade, and there was a lady who's unnamed in books, but she's the wife of a man called John Weston. And they were local men. They were tried, this man and lady, in the heresy trials in Norwich. They weren't from Norwich, we don't think. Almost all the 200 people were from outside of Norwich, around the county. And they were burned also at some point. And there are two other people who are very interesting, and if you read and follow up this history, they come up quite often. They're two ladies, because we want to bring the ladies into this, don't we? Why should the men suffer? And one of them was called Hoisia Moon. Her husband was Thomas Moon, and they were locals. They lived in Ludham, so we are told. No, sorry, they didn't. Somebody else did. But they were from, not certain where they were from. I haven't got it down here. Perhaps it doesn't say. A lot of this stuff on the joke wasn't that good, was it? Joke wasn't that good, was it? You're laughing away. I thought people don't usually laugh at anything I say. Oh. Hoisia and Thomas Moon. They were a married couple, and they were of high social status. He was a shoemaker. He had a big house and servants. And this is interesting, you see. They offered hospitality to Lollards who were on the run. And they led a Lollard school, a kind of Bible study and teaching for Lollards. And apparently Hoisia had attended one herself as a younger woman. And in 1430, Thomas was arrested for doing all this stuff. But the magistrates said, well, he's an old man, he's getting on a bit, he's frail, so we'll suspend his punishment. And Hoisia was tried for heresy and recanted. Some people believe this was just lip service. But you notice he was let off. And was it just mercy on the part of the magistrates or priests who tried him, or bishop, whoever it was, it's not said. Or was it because he was a man of higher social status, and so he could get away with it? It could have been genuine compassion. This is something that comes out a lot. Then there was a lady called Marjorie Baxter. She's quite well known in early nonconformist heretical history. She came from Martham. She knew Hoisia and been influenced by her. But she wasn't an upper class woman, and she wasn't very bright, it appears. She said some stupid things. A lot of these people, you see, were just cottoning on, and they heard good. They didn't like the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't like the priests. They didn't like going to Mass and all that. They didn't understand it. They didn't like being pushed around by these posh people who lived in big monasteries and churches and rectories. And so when they got a wind of protest, they cottoned on to it. Oh, we like this protest, without necessarily understanding what Wycliffe and these people were saying. They just thought, well, it must be good because they're knocking the people we don't like. And she might have been one. She said silly things. She was quite unsubtle, and she was arrested several times. She claimed it was perfectly satisfactory for Christians to pray to dead men. And we mentioned William White, the first man to be burned. She said, I pray to William White, and he helps me. But there is no record anywhere of her actually being executed or particularly strongly punished, it doesn't seem. Perhaps they just thought, well, he's a nutter. There were a few others. The man called William Sawtrey who comes up, he came from Lynn, and that area, he was a priest, and he recanted when he was tried for heresy, said he was sorry, and then he came down to London, apparently in a parish St. Office somewhere in London, and he then went back and started preaching the same heresy, and he was burned at Smithfield. That was quite early on, 1401. A man called William Thorpe, and another man called Brady were all burned at Smithfield, and another man called William Taylor at Canterbury. I just mentioned these names. It's worth remembering, just to speak the name again, because they are Christian men who died for their faith. There's not much said about them. I had great difficulty on the internet looking up some of these things. And a lot of stuff you read in a book, and then you read something slightly different in another book. Well, we come to the reign of Henry VIII now. We've passed through the Lollard period, and we've jumped from the early 1400s up to Henry VIII's day, the early 1500s, 1520s, 30s. And the most famous one of all probably is Thomas Bilney, name you'll all know, I'm sure. And he was burned in the Lollard's pit. And he was Cambridge, he was an educated man, a priest, well educated, Cambridge man, but he was tormented with a deep sense of sin. This is what Luther had been like as a young man. But he found peace through reading Paul's writings, letters, St. Paul's letters. And he tried to share his newfound understanding as widely as he could, which was perceived as heresy by a lot of leaders. And so he was arrested and tried, and he recanted. And then he moved away, and he came to Norwich. And according to Fox's Book of Martyrs, when he was in Norwich, he ministered to lepers, physically and spiritually. Preached with them, read the Bible with them, but he also helped to nurse them, care for them. I love to think of him being in the place up Sprouston. What's it called now? I forget the name of it. Yes, yeah. It was a library when we first moved into Norwich about 20 years ago. It was one of our local branch library, and then it was closed down. It's got something going on there now, but we don't know that he was there, because there were a whole lot of leper houses all around the city, especially at city gates, because that's quite near Magdalen Gate, isn't it? And all around the city there was leper houses. And he was accused of giving some scriptures to an anchoress in the city. People believe it was probably Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, which had only just come out. It was printed abroad, smuggled into this country, and it was a punishable offence to have that. Well, it was still the law not to have a Bible in the English language. And Tyndale himself, of course, was murdered for doing it. But it's believed that we don't know for certain, but he was arrested then a second time, and he was held in the Guildhall up there in the marketplace. And there's a plate on the wall, isn't there, in the sort of end opposite the taxi rank there, remembering Bilney. And there's another one on the wall of Surrey Chapel. And he was then marched down eventually through over Bishop Bridge and across to the Lollard's pit and tied to the stake. And a large crowd of people came pouring out, standing, watching, and crying out in support for him and saying, "This is wrong, shouldn't be doing this, he's a good man." Bilney had asked, could he be tried by the king? If Henry's court had tried him, he could have been charged as a traitor and hung. But the church insisted, no, it's heresy and we've got to try him. And the church, you see, when you were condemned by the church, you were burned. Hanging wasn't a joke in those days. Well, I don't suppose it's ever been a joke. But there was no drop in those days. You didn't have a trap door. You just stood on something on the back of a horse or on a bench or something, and they put the rope around your neck and they knocked it away and you swung and strangled to death. It could take half an hour or more, struggling and kicking. So none of this is a joke, It's horrific stuff. All being done in the name of the Christian church. And in the crowd, the mayor of Norwich was there, showing support for Bilney, and Matthew Parker, who's a Norwich man. I don't know if you know that. Matthew Parker's parents' grave is in the churchyard of St Clement's Church, just down the road. And he was baptised in that church under the flyover here, St Saviour's is it called, I think. And if you don't know who he was an Anglican priest, and he was Anne Boleyn's chaplain. And when she was going to die, she committed her daughter Elizabeth and said, look after her and see that she's brought up as a Protestant, which he did. And when Elizabeth became queen, she made him the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's a very prominent man. And he was there, rooting for Bilney, and lots of other people. And the nasty character, Sir Thomas More, he said that Bilney did actually recant in the fire, cried out in repentance. But everybody in the crowd said he didn't. And it's said that Thomas More tried to persuade the mayor and Parker and various people to say that they'd heard Bilney recant, and they refused to do so. They said, no, he didn't. And they stood by him in his memory. So that he was a very remarkable man. Although, having said that, was he any more remarkable than any of the others that died for their faith? So there weren't many executed in Henry's day for religious purposes. We move on to the reign of Edward VI, Henry's son, and there are only one or two recorded executions in Edward's reign. There's much more peaceable reign for Protestants, because the people behind the throne, Duke of Somerset and other people, were strong Protestants, and the laws against having a Bible in English had now been suspended, and it was no longer a criminal offence to have your Bible in English. Edward's reign began with Kett's Rebellion, which was a political socio-rebellion, nothing to do with religion. But what is interesting is when they got up onto Kett's, what is now called the heath up there, Kett's Heath, when they got up there all camping, they wanted services to be held. And they said, we will name the men we want to come and take our services. So they had their eye on certain men who were obviously sympathetic. And there were two men, one called Watson and one called Croniers, who were both clergy in the cathedral. And they were the two men, they said, we want them to come and take our services. And Matthew Parker, was still around. He tried to intervene and moderate between them and the authorities. There was a guy called Henry Hart, who lived in the Kent and Essex area, and he was a very radical man at this time. And he was what was called a free willer. He didn't accept the Protestant doctrine, Lutheran doctrine of predestination, as some people didn't. And he was very active from 1530 until his death in 1557. So he goes from Henry VIII right through just into Queen Elizabeth's reign. He was rarely ever arrested, and he died eventually, apparently it appears about 1558, still a free man. Another man called Ledley was a kind of associate of Hart. He died in prison, 1547. Then the interesting one that comes up a lot in the Edwards period is a lady called Joan Bocher. She came from Essex, and she was a very radical woman in the Essex area. It's said that her husband had been executed a few years earlier for heresy, but no details are recorded. But she is specially remembered for being found during the Lent fast with lovely big chunks of meat in the pot on the fire there. And she just treated the Lent fast with contempt and had a good feast. And that is the thing that's always remembered of her. I suppose she's a bit different there than the others. But she was burned during Edward's reign at Smithfield in 1550. Then there was a man called John Champneys, came from Somerset and came to London. He was arrested during Edward's reign, but then he was released. Nothing is heard about him during Mary's reign, but he's back again in the headlines in Queen Elizabeth's reign. And then I love what I read in a book, a man writing this, the man that wrote about this, said then, at some point in Queen Elizabeth's reign, he took a leaf out of Melchizedek's book and just vanished, leaving no record. And I think that's lovely. If you're not certain, any of you, in the Old Testament, in Genesis, there is a man called Melchizedek who suddenly appears, no beginning and no end. And he's superior, it appears, even to Abraham. He's an important priest of some kind. Always been a mystery who he is, what he was. But this guy is much the same, I gather. And then another man from Edward's reign. This is a very strange man, Robert Couch. And he's the first known English Anabaptist. If you don't know what an Anabaptist is, it's someone who refuses to acknowledge infant baptism where it's been administered and will baptise a person who's already been christened as a baby. The church says that's rebaptism. That's what the word Anabaptist means. The Anabaptist says, no, it isn't. He hasn't had a proper baptism. I'm doing it for the first time. And you meet these people. There's one of them talking to you at this moment. I'm an Anabaptist. I was christened as a baby, and when I grew up and became a Christian, I threw it to one side and said, that's nonsense. I've never been christened, Baptist. And I was baptised again. And when I was a Baptist pastor, I baptised one or two people who had been christened in the local parish church years before. And they came to me and said, we've become Christians. We don't think we've been baptised. And I said, no, you haven't. And the local rector was unhappy because they told him a couple of weeks before, Ted's going to baptise us in a couple of weeks' time. Are you going to come? It was being done on a Sunday afternoon so that as many people from the area could all come. And they went and told the rector, we're going to baptise. And the rector said, yes, I know, I'll come along, because he thought he was going to be friendly. And then my friend said to him, of course, I was christened as a baby in the church at Tunstead, but I don't. So poor old Arthur Green, the rector, couldn't come. I don't think he wanted to, but the bishop had told him you must never go to anything like that at all. And he was apologetic to me, but I think he was glad he didn't come, and he didn't really approve of me doing it. But we have to accept these things. So we move on. Oh, no, I was still talking about this guy. He's an Anabaptist. He was a cellarer to Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife. So he was right there in the palace, looking after the wine and stuff in the cellars, quite openly talking about Anabaptist. He was a singer in the Royal Chapel of Edward VI and Queen Elizabeth. And he was in a very precarious position, but he seems to have got away with it. So no one's quite certain when he died. It's not recorded in history. Okay, now we come to Mary Tudor's reign. This is the sad time. I always feel very sorry for Mary Tudor. I'm not supposed to as a Protestant, but I do. I think she was the most devout monarch this country has ever had on the throne. She actually took religion seriously, not like her father or her sister, who used it for their own ends, and most monarchs ever since. She actually believed. The problem was she had the wrong religion. She was very serious. She was the head of the church, and she knew her responsibilities. Ahab hadn't taken his responsibilities seriously. He'd let the prophets of Baal get away with it. And God had to raise up Elijah to go and destroy them. And Mary wasn't going to neglect her responsibilities. These heretics, these Protestants, they're the prophets of Baal. They're devilish people, and I will destroy them. That's my job. And she believed that. She was ever just a sad woman. She never forgot the way in which her mother... She was Spanish, I don't know if you realise that, Mary Tudor. She was half English by blood because her father was Henry VIII, an Anglo-Welsh man. But her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was Spanish, and she identified totally with her mother. And she remembered how Henry VIII had treated her mother so disgustingly. And the Reformation, in a sense, was this huge insult to her mother, and she never forgot that. And, of course, she was desperate to be a mother herself. and had these phantom pregnancies and would go around swelling up. And then she'd go to bed and they'd be waiting for the child to be delivered, and it'd turn out there was nothing at all. And it's a very, very sad life. And, as Protestants, we love to denigrate her. But we've got to be careful. It's very sad. But she certainly took it out on the Protestant Reformation. And most of the names now on that stone, all the rest of the names are Marian martyrs. There's Simon Miller. He lived in King's Lynn. And he came to Norwich and he stood outside of a church asking people where he could get a proper communion when they came in, needing, I don't want the mass or anything. And he was taken to the chancellor of the cathedral, who committed him to custody. And then they let him go home to sort out his affairs, as long as he promised he would come back, which he did. And then he was executed on 13th of July, 1557. And at the same time, there was a lady called Elizabeth Cooper. She was the wife of a pewterer, and she was from St Andrew's parish. Some of you here tonight, I think, have got connections with St Andrew's Church. And she had recanted at some point of heresy, and she felt convicted, guilty for having done so. So she stood up in a service one day, in the middle of a service, and announced that I am ashamed of having revoked my recantation, and I do believe the heresies for what I was charged for, and I say so now openly, and I caution any of you never to do the wicked thing that I've done. Say you don't believe it and then come back. It's wrong. And people were horrified, some were anyway, and she was taken to the sheriff of Norwich, and Mr. Sutton wanted her arrested and punished. And Mr. Sutton didn't really want to, because he knew her, and they'd apparently as young people been servants together in a big household somewhere. And he tried to avoid it, but people said, "Oh, come on, you're the sheriff, do your job." And he thought, well, if I don't, it's going to look bad for me. I'm going to be in trouble. So he did reluctantly have her arrested, and she was condemned to death, and she was tied to the stake with this Simon Miller. And as the flames started, she suddenly screamed out in pain, as you'd expect. And Miller said to her, apparently, "Be of good courage, sister. We shall have a joyful and sweet supper together." And then she stood, apparently, without any further flinching, went to her death. And as it was happening, as they were being burned, a lady called Cicely Ormes, who was from the parish of St Lawrence, she stood up and shouted out, "I'll be willing to die for my faith as well." So she was given her wish. She was put into prison, and a few months later she was burned at the Lollard's pit. Then there's another man called Thomas Crasfield on that memorial. Died 1557. I can find out nothing about him. I put in a search on the website. His name comes up, only referring to this or similar stones, lists of names, no details given. And every now and again, one of them will say, one of the sites when I plumb in, "Do you mean Thomas Crossfield?" Well, I don't know if I mean Thomas Crossfield or not. I just don't know. So all I can say is this man, Thomas Crossfield, he's spelt with an A on the memorial there, he died in 1557. And then there are three men there in 1558 mentioned, Thomas Carman, and he had supported Crasfield at his trial and execution. And this was noted that he was encouraging him and supporting him. So he was arrested and then he was burned the following year. And then there's a man called William Seaman, and he was a farmer of some sort, husbandman, and he was only aged 26, came from Martlesham. He had a wife and 3 children apparently, and he was arrested by a friend, Robert Balding, who was a friend and neighbour in Martlesham, but this guy nonetheless shopped him because he felt that it might do him good, his reputation with the local authorities. And he wanted to demonstrate his orthodoxy. And it's said that as they were carrying away, Robert Balding and some other men came and took this William Seaman and bounding up. They were carrying him away in the night, and suddenly there was a strong light flashed across the sky, And this balding fell to the ground, and although he had been hitherto a strong, healthy man, he never enjoyed good health again for the rest of his life. Now, you make what you like of that, I don't know, but that's the story that's told about it. They took him to the Bishop of Norwich, Hopton, who was quite a nasty character, one gets the impression, for interrogation. And he was asked why his charge was he wouldn't attend Mass. And he said, well, it's just an idol, I don't believe in it. And he was held in the jail until he was executed. His wife and 3 children were driven out of Martlesham because they wouldn't attend Mass either. And all their goods were confiscated. And his mother, who was in her late 70s, was also driven out and wandered around sleeping rough or begging hospitality from friends. And when she heard that her elderly husband back home was very ill, she then went back to care for him until he died. And in spite of any consequences, people knowing I'm here in the town, back again, I'm here and I'm looking after my husband. And nobody touched her for that. And her husband died, and then she died. But when she was dead, the authorities told all her friends, you cannot give her a Christian funeral. She must be buried in some obscure place. So that was her punishment. And then there's Thomas Hudson. He was a glove maker from Aylsham. He had a wife and 3 children. And he had heard the gospel being preached and learned to read in order to read a Bible. And there must have been a lot of people like that in England who were learning to read. Now, in some ways, before the Bible was circulating, there was perhaps nothing for people to read. But you get the Bible. And it's interesting, although Chaucer didn't support the Lollards in theory and never came out because he was a contemporary of Wycliffe back in the 1300s. But it's interesting, in Chaucer's works, there were a lot of quotations from the Bible. He knew the Bible well, and a lot of people would not just be reading the Bible, they would learn from Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales is full of quotes from the Bible, including, "You are the salt of the earth," one of the characters says. You are the salt of the earth. Back in 2011, the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, I won't say I was amazed, I wasn't amazed, I was expected it. The rubbish that was produced in papers, there was a lot in the EDP, the Telegraph and the Guardian, magazines, all the stuff about the King James Bible. It shaped the English language, how wonderful. There was a whole list of statements like salt of the earth and skin of your teeth and all these things which were supposed to be come into our language from the King James Bible. And they're all in previous Bibles. Salt of the earth was in Wycliffe's translation. Salt of the earth, as I say, was quoted. In fact, if you go back to the old Lindisfarne Gospels from 800 AD, and as you know, or perhaps you don't, over the top of this marvellous, beautiful, decorated manuscript, someone has gone through about 100 years later and done an Anglo-Saxon translation of all 4 Gospels. Scribbly hand. Some critics say it's a desecration of this great work of art. Other people, like myself, think it's marvellous. And it says there, salt of the earth, right back there, 900 AD. And in fact, if you know anything about Greek, and I expect one or two of you here do, you'll know that that phrase in the Greek New Testament cannot possibly be translated any other way. But anyway, this guy learnt to read the Bible. And when Mary came to the throne, he avoided church attendance and had travelled all over Suffolk trying to elude capture. And then he returned home to comfort his family, and he built a hideaway in a wooden shed where he could spend all his time reading and praying. And this went on for about 6 months. Then the vicar pestered his wife to know what had happened to him. Where is he? And she wouldn't betray her husband, but then he started getting very zealous and singing psalms and praying loudly. And it said that people came and stood around his hideaway listening to him. And then he started going around the town singing and denouncing the Mass. And then he returned home, so it said. and sat there for 3 days and nights, taking no food, just reading, singing and praying. And the vicar, a man named Berry, who was known for his very licentious lifestyle, had him arrested and beaten, and he was sent to Norwich and executed. And then the last one of that 1558 group in Norwich, a man called Richard Yeoman, and he was a curate to Dr. Taylor at Hasley. Dr. Taylor was quite a famous Christian man of the day. I believe he was more reformed, puritanically inclined. But Taylor left, moved away, and a man called Newell came, and he dismissed Yeoman, who then went into Kent and earned his living travelling around as a vendor of lace and pins and that sort of thing. He was put in the stocks at some point, but no charges were ever made, and he returned to his hometown of Hadley and lived in secret, praying and reading, while his wife supported him by begging. But he was eventually arrested and put in the stocks alongside a man called John Dale, who had already been sitting in the stocks for several days. Dale was, they said, an old man, only 46, with good knowledge of the Bible, and steadfastly confessed his faith. Now, this is interesting as well. You see, Newell, the vicar, called upon the local magistrate and squire, Sir Henry Doyle, and said, we want this man taken to Norwich and charged. And this magistrate didn't want to do it. He said, hasn't he suffered enough? Let go of it, forget it. And this is something that happens a lot. Surprising, all through these times of persecution, there are people in high places who don't want to do it. They're humane, and even if they don't agree with a heretic, they still say, we're not going to leave them alone. But anyway, Newell said to the guy, you've got to do it, it's your job. And the man realised if he didn't do it, he'd be in trouble. Makes him look bad. So the guy was taken off Yeoman and was sent to Norwich, the trials, and executed in 1558. So that's sad. In Elizabeth's reign, according to an article in Wikipedia, there are 4 people burned in Norwich. A man called Matthew Hannant, John Lewis, Peter Cole, and Francis Kett. But I don't know why, and you can't always trust stuff in Wikipedia. All sorts of people put stuff on, but they were burnt at Norwich. I think that's definite, but whether they were burnt for religious heresies or whether something else, I just don't know. And it's interesting that even in Mary Tudor's reign, most of these people who were burnt weren't actually burnt for owning a Bible, whether that was illegal, but they were burnt for their attacking the Mass or the priesthood, that sort of thing. Are there any questions? I've gone on a long time. I don't know when I was supposed to finish. Any questions anyone wants to ask?
Just quickly, Secretary, that was excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Wycliffe, I was under the impression there were 2 very specific versions he produced, but you're implying it was more sort of a blur from the early to the late.
Yeah. He did. The ones that come out during his lifetime are the poorer quality, and they're totally different to what he was writing himself. He was no fool. He's a great scholar. And they're called the early version and the late version. That was what the Forshaw and Madden called them. But as I say, EV and LV. But modern people, having more time over the years to look at them and analyse them, say there's a slow progress as the translators. Nobody knows who did it. Forshaw and Madden said that it was they thought the early versions were done by Wycliffe with somebody called, I think it's Hartford or something, who later became a heretic actually and turned against him. And they said the later versions were done by a man called John Purves. But I don't think anyone believes that now. It's quite a mystery as to who were doing these things. And they're called late version and early and late. Yes, you're right. But they're all slightly different. And I've looked at the one down there about John's Gospel, the late version, And that is slightly different to my printed copy that came, the 1388 New Testament, and everything seems to be slightly different. It's quite a mystery. Yeah.
Question. But when people were burned at the stake as opposed to being hung,
Yeah.
was that a sign of purification?
I don't know. I don't know why they burn people. Perhaps they did think that. No, I don't know. Burning is a common way, I suppose, in different cultures throughout the world of killing people. Well, yes, you couldn't be buried. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, because Wycliffe was buried, and then sometime, he died by, say, 1384, sometime about 1440, they dug him up and burned him and scattered his bones, his ashes, in the water. And the big thing people like to say, it's a bit sentimental, is of course now he's gone all throughout the world, his ashes. But I mean, what good are ashes? The important thing was his Bible went throughout the world.
Thank you.
So come and have a look at these things down here, if you want to.
Ted knows so much of history. If you found that helpful, Ted is going to be giving a couple of talks during the Heritage Week on the history of the Congregational Church. So watch out for publicity and come and hear Ted again.